aim trainers instead of getting better at aiming in FPS games. And it's kind of intuitive, right? There are a lot of mechanics within FPS games that you can't train within an aim trainer, so it makes sense that there would be a point where your raw aim is good enough for whatever game you're training for, and that your time would be better spent playing the game than in an aim trainer. This idea is further supported by aim trainers pushing aim so much further than it usually is within games with faster and smaller targets. But is that actually the case? Is there actually a point where your raw mechanics can be so good that any improvement on top of that is only visible in aim trainers, and if there is, where is that point? The first time I saw this question was when I was initially getting into aim training. This was maybe 4 years ago now. The community was a lot smaller at the time, and because of that there wasn't really anywhere to go for information about aim training other than a few Discord servers. I remember the answer given was something along the lines of, "It's very useful when you're new, but trails off as you get better." I honestly can't tell a mastering player apart from the best aim trainer players in actual games. At the time I was 20 hours in and had just hit platinum on the Voltaic benchmarks, and I was improving my scores every day with my in-game performance following suit. I was honestly a little shocked just how much it helped me. I had already ironed out so many issues with my mechanics and I didn't see how that improvement could just stop. That being said though, I was only 2 ranks away from Master, which was scarily close to their proposed limit of how far it's worth climbing on these benchmarks. This was in the back of my mind as I kept playing, but the benefits I felt in game didn't stop when I did get Master. After 80 hours, it still felt like I was getting better each day, and watching old clips made it very easy to see my improvement. This was also around the time I began to really enjoy aim training. It was satisfying to see my scores go up overall, but I especially liked speed-focused scenarios. By 400 hours, I was still Master overall, but had pushed my speed target switching to the very top rank. I began to put more time into aim training than I did actual games, and when I did play FPSs, I didn't do much better than I did 300 hours of training earlier. Sure, my flicks felt faster from all the speed practice, but I lost a lot more gunfights than I did even before aim training at all, which honestly really affected my confidence. After all this time practicing, I still couldn't win my duels. I remember thinking back to that comment about how Master was the cutoff point and realizing that it did mostly align with my experience. My progress slowed down around Master too. The reason why I started all of this was to get better at FPS games, and if aim training wasn't going to help me anymore, why bother? Because of that, I mostly stopped playing aim trainers and went back to putting all of my time into FPS games, and I started seeing improvement in them again. I hit new peaks in CSGO, my flicks felt sharp in Battlefield, and my confidence slowly started coming back. I felt like that original comment was right, and that aim training had no value in games after around Masters. But if that was the case, what would be the reason? My guess was that no game I played stressed raw mechanics enough for it to make a difference. CSGO focused more on crosshair placement and micro adjustments than wide flicks, and the same was true for Valorant, but my flicks were already good enough for Battlefield and COD. Even in a game like Apex with a longer time to kill, my tracking improved more from just playing the game than it did from aim training. I had already gotten my underlying mechanics to a high enough level, with every skill being at least Masters, and any extra time spent aim training would be wasted just like the last 300 hours were. I did play a bit more after this, but it was exclusively for fun, not with the goal of improving in games. I'm sure some of you can see the flaw in my logic already, but it took until mid-2022 when I finally came back to aim training for me to spot it. I started playing again to compete with a friend and one of his friends. He challenged me to beat their scores in a few different tracking scenarios. This was one of my weakest skills, mainly since I barely played it when aim training prior. It was a bit of a grind with some back and forth between us, but I did eventually match and even surpass them both, bringing my tracking up to the same rank as my old target switching scores. And to my surprise, when trying out Apex again after all this, I felt a massive improvement in my ability to read and track enemies' movements. I was so much more consistent. Throughout that entire competition, I was just doing it, well, to compete. I had a fun time trying to beat my friends' scores and pushing myself further, but I honestly didn't think it would help since my tracking was already pretty good in aim trainers. Ever since I first heard the idea of a limit to aim training's helpfulness, I'd seen that idea mirrored by so many people, placing that limit around the Jade or Master ranks. That was meant to be the point where any progress further was just getting better at aim trainers, learning the scenario and whatnot, but if that was true, then why did I improve so much going from Grandmaster to Astra? Watching back my old clips, my flicks actually did improve a lot after playing aim trainers, but it was the other parts of my aim that made it feel like they hadn't. So now I've trained both reactive tracking and speed target switching up to an Astra level and felt benefits in game from both, so where does that put our limit of aim training's usefulness? The intuitive answer is Astra, but does my experience really prove it? What if it was just placebo? What if it was just those two categories that transfer over well? What if getting into the top 10 helped further still? I don't feel like I'd do the topic justice without putting these questions to the test myself. One of my longest goals in aim training has been being in the top 10 worldwide on the Season 3 voltaic benchmarks. This is my score sheet currently, placing me at number 54 on the leaderboard. To get into the top 10, I would have to push every scenario to Astra as well as pushing around half to Celestial. I don't even know if it's possible for me. It's a very far out there goal, but I think it's needed if I want to properly answer this question. So after reaching top 10 worldwide as well as pushing all of my scores past my old peaks, I can say that honestly, it helped me way more than I thought it would. It felt like most of the scenarios had their benefits in game, and while there were a few scenarios that didn't help much, these were the exceptions. This improvement is even more crazy to me considering I was doing something I don't normally do and that you're not meant to do for in-game improvement. Even though I did play other scenarios to practice, most of my time was spent grinding the benchmarks. This does raise the question though, if getting into the top 10 helped me so much, why did I struggle to win my duels even after reaching a high rank in aim trainers in the past? I think what it came down to was that while I had pushed the ceiling of my mechanics higher through all the speed practice, because I was going for those faster flicks, I lost some of the consistency I had before when flicking slower. When I stopped aim training, I stopped trying to flick as fast, and because of that, I got some of my consistency back. After playing them again recently though, I have the consistency to go for those quick flicks, and if I do miss, I can fall back on my strong micro adjustments, which I just didn't have developed before. I think consistency really is at the center of all of this. It's the main thing aim trainers help with for me, and also rebuts another one of the explanations I had for why aim trainers didn't work in the past. While games don't push aim as far as aim trainers do in individual situations, that doesn't matter since what you're searching for is consistency, which can almost always be improved. Even if you can aim at a target way smaller or more evasive than anything seen in any FPS game, could you do it every time? Because in games you have to. You can't reset the round or load up a different scenario. When you are placed in a situation that calls for good mechanics, you have to aim well in it every time or lose. This is why I think aim training will always have its uses at any skill level. While it's exceptionally useful for new players, even very experienced players will benefit from building that consistency, which is easier in aim trainers due to its long scenario times. On top of that, they help you stay consistent by removing the downtime between aiming that's present in most games, especially compared to a battle royale like Apex. Another big mistake I made was in my scenario selection. When I was aim training a lot, I was putting almost all of my time into target switching and barely any into my other skills. This was honestly really visible watching my gameplay. My flicks were sharp, but my micro adjustments were really inaccurate. In games like Counter-Strike though, those micro adjustments are what really matters. Most of the time you'll be correcting to somewhere near the angle you're pre-aiming, so the total amount of mouse movement is very minimal. The same thing applies for Apex. I should have been focusing on my smoothness instead of trying to work on my adjustment speed. That game has relatively slower acceleration, so being able to snap back onto a target instantly when tracking isn't as useful as maximizing your damage on strafes. I think this is something a lot of people get wrong when trying aim trainers. While lower rank players can play all aiming categories equally and see improvement in game, if you're already above, say, Diamond on the voltaic benchmarks, the general mouse control gains will stop being as visible from day to day and you'll benefit from specializing a little. Watch some gameplay and see what kind of movements you're making when aiming, and choose scenarios and aim trainers that contain similar movements to isolate them. It doesn't have to be one-to-one. As long as it's hitting the same general skill set, it'll be so much more effective than exclusively focusing on fundamentals. That doesn't mean the other category is useless. It's important to bring your fundamentals up to a strong level to provide a solid base to build upon when trying to lean into niches. It loops back around to consistency in a way. Just as you need to win games, building fundamentals is all about making sure you can do the simple movements perfectly, every time. Aiming really is a lot more in depth than most people think. Even at a very high level, there is still so much to isolate and improve upon, and the results of that training do shine through into FPS games. It's a skill with basically no ceiling, and while it isn't the only deciding factor in most games, there are a lot of tools that basically just come down to who can click on the target better. That doesn't mean you can just neglect playing FPS games if you want to have good aim within them though. The way I see it, aim training builds your raw aim or mouse control, which is an underlying skill that supports game-specific skills. The better your raw aim is, the easier it is to develop these skills, but they still have to be developed independently. This is another thing that I did wrong before. I played more aim trainers than FPSs and thought that since my raw aim was good, it would just carry over without any effort. But without learning the game itself, I couldn't fully leverage my aim to excel within it. Looking at the finals as an example, when trying to pick it up recently, I focused on learning the recoil patterns, finding out about techniques like recoil smoothing, getting familiar with how fast different characters accelerate, and adapting to aiming at bounce pads, grapples, or dashes. I could isolate all of that from my raw aim since I didn't have to think about my underlying mechanics at all, which along with spending far more time playing the game than I did aim training led to me picking it up rather quickly. At the end of the day, aim training should always be supplementary to playing the game. Now that I've reached my goal on the benchmarks, I spend about 15 minutes warming up before I play and 30 to 40 minutes focusing on issues I notice during the play session afterwards, and only benchmark myself for about an hour once a week. This is what I think works best for me and gives me the most value for my time, but that will probably be different for you. Different games place different levels of emphasis on game-specific mechanics versus raw aim, and it's best to decide how to balance your time based on that. Generally though, I wouldn't recommend spending more than 20% of your playtime on an aim trainer. To end this off, I just want to say that even if this hadn't have helped in-game, I wouldn't regret the time I spent. Setting myself a goal like this and slowly working towards it was so rewarding, and the payoff of actually achieving it was more than worth the hours I put in. I learned a bit about what methods work best for me when striving for something like this as well, from how to discipline myself into doing somewhat tedious tasks, to breaking the task into smaller chunks and hyper-focusing on each, which honestly will help me in other areas of my life too. It's already helped me when making this video. This project has been very fulfilling for me, and it's reminded me of the power that setting clear goals and chipping away at them can have, both in and outside of FPS games. In previous videos, I've talked a lot about different aiming misconceptions, and most of them tend to start and end with the idea of instant improvement. And the conclusion to all of those videos has been that there is no cheat code to aiming, and that it just comes down to putting in the time needed to develop your skills. But then, if you can't optimize outside factors, can you optimize the time you put in instead? Is there a most efficient way to train your aim, and if there is, what is it, and how far can we narrow this down? If you haven't already heard of them, aim trainers are that most efficient method. When compared to trying to train your aim by just playing the game, the amount of time you spend actually aiming is way higher in an aim trainer, meaning you get more practice in for your time, and on top of that, the ridiculous number of scenarios gives far more options when it comes to working on weaknesses in your aim when compared with any in-game training tool. Even if these scenarios aren't one-to-one with a specific game, aim trainers are still the best way to develop good technique, which will carry over into any FPS game. This probably isn't new info for you, but something I haven't heard answered as much is the how. How do we actually isolate and improve upon weaknesses? How can you tell what your weaknesses even are, and what's with all this vague discussion about good technique? My goal with this video is to go through everything you need to know to get into aim training and how to get the most out of it. I'm hoping to write this in a way that will naturally follow players' progression, and the info will build on what's said prior, but if you are more experienced and already know the basics, don't be afraid to skip ahead. For now though, let's start at the start. Which aim trainer should you choose? There are two main options I'd recommend to beginners, Aimlabs and Kovacs. Kovacs has better scenarios that cover a wider range of skills, and I strongly recommend it if the main game you play is Apex Legends for a reason I'll get into later, but Aimlabs is free. If you aren't sure you want to spend a lot of time aim training, I recommend starting with Aimlabs and seeing if you stick with it, and if you do, swap over to Kovacs. If you are going to put the time in, it's well worth the asking price. So you've got your aim trainer. What now? The first step is to get some nice settings. I've linked 2 videos below, both by Matty OW, where he talks about his Kovacs and AimLab settings. How much these matter for improvement is debatable, but I personally find it a lot easier to commit to playing aim trainers with nice hit sounds and visuals. After that, I'd recommend trying the voltaic benchmarks. These aren't an all-in-one training tool, but they do provide some good scenarios to start with. However, more importantly, they give you an idea of where your skills stand relative to each other. This is the easiest way to identify weaknesses when you're starting out, and I think when you're below diamond on these benchmarks, it's worth trying to keep all of your skills at mostly the same level. So if you have any categories or scenarios that are significantly lower than everything else, try to bring those up to the rank of your best skills. This is because even though some skills are more applicable to some games than others at all levels, but especially when first starting out, the concentrated practice that any of these scenarios provide will benefit you in game, even if right now it might not be obvious how these things link together. If you're on AimLab, you can find the benchmarks on the Voltaic website. Click Assess Your Aim and try out the scenarios, and it'll automatically fill out your scores for you as you play. This is going to be done with Kovacs benchmarks at some point in the future, but for now you can find them on this spreadsheet. You fill your scores in here as you play each task, or you can use the Auto Updater tool, which does this for you, and all 3 of these are linked in the description. I would recommend only playing the benchmarks maybe 2 times a week at most. They are good for testing yourself, and especially when you're first getting into aim training, they will help you improve, but I still think most of your time should be spent practicing. This practice comes in multiple forms. How I approach this personally is something I'll cover in a bit, but as a baseline when starting out, if you want to aim train every day, I would recommend spending 3 days playing playlists that target weak areas in your benchmarks, 2 days playing either the fundamental or game-specific routines for your game of choice, and the other 2 days benchmarking, but this is just a guideline. I've also linked a bunch of both game-specific and weakness-focused routines by myself and others in the description as starting points, but these are just guidelines as well. As your main weaknesses or main games change, you should change routines to match, but you can customize them further. If you think a routine is too long for how much time you have or too hard for your current skill level, don't be afraid to remove scenarios or change scenarios out for easier versions. It's totally okay to change these things to suit your preference or time restrictions. There is a more important discussion to be had when it comes to time management and aim training though, which is how you should balance your time spent in the game versus aim training. This varies so much, it's hard for me to even give a rough estimate, but it depends on your experience and game of choice. The less experienced you are on mouse and keyboard, the bigger the benefits of aim training will be, since an hour of aim training for a person who started playing on PC yesterday is a much larger percent of their total playtime than an hour of aim training would be for me. Because of that, it's easier to justify playing more aim training relative to others when you're brand new. The other big factor is which game you play. Valorant and most other tactical shooters forces its players to get very good at one specific skill, micro adjustments. There are exceptions, but you can win a lot of gunfights in that game by just being able to make small movements accurately. Compare this to Apex or other high time to kill games, where its wider weapon variety and higher time to kill force more consistent and varied aim over a longer period, placing a higher demand on raw mechanical skill. This means that the benefits of aim training will shine through more in Apex, especially scenarios like Control Sphere, Whisphere, and Air, which not only feel very analogous to tracking in that game, but they also develop very important fundamental skills and basically force good technique, which will help you in game. This is also why I recommend Kovacs so strongly for Apex players, by the way. AimLab doesn't do scenarios like this nearly as well. These tracking tasks will help in Valorant as well, but only for the fundamentals and skills they build. The movements don't directly translate, put a pin in that, I'll come back to this later. So those are the 2 main factors, skill level and game of choice. Personally though, I'd put an upper limit of spending 20% of your daily FPS playtime in an aim trainer. Past this, you're typically getting into the territory of diminishing returns, and that time is better spent playing the game. A little bit ago, I mentioned technique, and this is a topic with so much depth I can't cover it all in this video, but I think it can be underpinned with a single idea, which is making your mouse movements more efficient. This on its own is somewhat meaningless, but it should become a bit more valuable after going through some of the aiming categories and seeing how it applies within them. Static clicking is, on its surface, the simplest category, and when I first saw a scenario like this, I thought, how could this possibly be useful? It's just dots on a wall, and yet it's invaluable for developing and refining proper flick technique. When you're playing scenarios like this, try to make a fast initial flick which lands close to the target before making a smaller movement to correct for any errors made during your first. The simplicity of this scenario type is its strength. These two core movements, the flick and micro-correction, appear everywhere in more advanced forms, but by stripping away all of that fluff, you can isolate the underlying motions. To link it back to that key idea, there are two main ways you should try to optimize your mouse movements. For both initial flicks and micro adjustments, you want to try and draw as straight of a line as possible between your starting point and the target. Curving or having jagged lines is a pretty common issue and something to try and smooth out sooner rather than later, even if it comes at the cost of initial flick speed. The second thing to focus on is where your flick lands. Obviously, dead on is ideal, but this isn't always possible, and underflicking is far preferable to overflicking. This is because of the change in the direction of the force you're applying when you overflick and have to correct backwards. It's a lot harder than just following through with the same motion. This concept is even more applicable to tracking, it just applies in different ways. One of the most common issues I see in tracking is over-adjusting after the target changes directions. Both overshooting and landing on the far side of the target are suboptimal here, since even if you don't miss initially, you're still moving the mouse more than you have to. This increases the amount of distance the target travels relative to your crosshair, making their movements harder to read. This often leads into chaining these over-adjustments together, which leads to this feeling of always lagging behind what the target's actually doing. The easiest way to avoid this is try to land on the middle or inner edge of the target. By minimizing your mouse movement, you make it easier to read the targets, and when it changes directions again, you'll remain on it for longer before having to readjust. Dynamic clicking almost blends both of these because it requires clean flicks to first reach the target, clean micro adjustments when needed, and good movement reading skills that tell where the target is going to end up. Having straight lines and not overshooting helps with movement reading as well, combining the skills needed in the two previous categories, and again, minimizing mouse movement is what is needed to have good technique in all three. That's most of the key information needed to get started and get a lot of value out of aim training, but what if this isn't working for you? Maybe you've reached a plateau and you're looking for a new way to practice. And I think this will happen to everyone at some point. Routines are good, but can only get you so far, and in my opinion, past a certain rank you need to look into more self-directed training. What I do personally when training for a specific FPS game is I'll play aim trainers for maybe 15 minutes as a warm-up beforehand, and after my play session I'll aim train again for another 30 to 45 minutes, but during that time I'll focus more specifically on issues I noticed while playing. As an example, if I'm playing the finals and I notice that I'm somewhat shaky when trying to track with my arm, after my play session I'd play some smoothbot to try and address that issue instead of doing any weakness-specific routines. The caveat with this is that you have to be able to pick out your issues very quickly. VOD reviewing might be helpful if you can't do it in real time, but this is something I'd only recommend trying if you have hit that plateau and you want to try and change up your approach. But what is the benefit of choosing my own scenarios instead of choosing a routine containing scenarios that are meant to do the same thing? The answer to this is threefold. A minor reason is that I personally find I improve faster if I change up what I'm doing consistently. Picking out scenarios to play by hand lets me do that far better than swapping between different routines. The next is that routines can sometimes lead to autopiloting, when you just hop on, play your routine, and pop off. This is fine and will still help, but I think forcing myself to be more mindful about what I'm playing and why I'm playing it helps give myself direction and prevents aim training from just becoming a habit. It's focused practice instead. Which leads well into the third point. Picking scenarios specifically gives me far more control over the level of focus I want to place on a certain skill. Even the best routines, unless they are made for you, can't target all of your weak points all of the time, but by doing this, I can make good on that initial pitch for aim training and isolate issues as specifically as possible to improve on them faster. The two hardest parts of this more self-directed approach is figuring out what your weaknesses are at a more specific level and finding the right scenarios to address them, so let's tackle those in order. When VOD reviewing your aim training gameplay, try to find a top run of that scenario and compare and contrast your run with theirs. To be specific, look at the differences in your approach and what skills they're leaning into to play it the way they do. I think this is best explained with an example, so I'm going to compare my static runs with a previous top static player with a similar style to my own. Trust the mix. When watching these two, you can see that we have a similar initial accuracy for smaller flicks, and I might even be better at these, but over wider angles, he both lands closer to the dot and corrects to it quicker. This is because most of the time when he does miss the initial flick, he stops before reaching the target, and all he needs to do is make a small correction in the same direction. Compare this to my run. I have more directional inaccuracy. My lines curve over wide distances, so I have to correct sideways, which takes longer. So I don't need to work on my closer flicks for now and should instead focus on cleaning up my lines on my wider ones. Even though Trusty and myself are fairly close in scores, this method still works with a wider skill gap between you and the person you're comparing to as well. Even if you can't isolate a specific thing that you're worse at, you can identify how they're approaching the scenario and figure out where you differ. For another example, my girlfriend JD has gotten into aim training recently and she watched Matty's VODs to learn from, even though she was several ranks lower. On Bounce 180 specifically, she noticed that he would mainly focus on targets towards the center of the map and often kill them right after they spawn, whereas she would focus on all targets equally and because of that lost a lot of score going for ones near the corners. By addressing this core issue in her approach, she was then able to focus on improving specific things like leading shots and building up speed over time instead of being stuck because of an incorrect technique. But how can you know what scenarios to play to actually do any of that? There is a list of recommended scenarios for Kovacs and Aimlabs by Voltaic, which has heaps of things to try out sorted by category, which should help narrow them down to what you're looking for. But if you want to be more specific, try to play variants of scenarios you know of by searching for the keyword of the scenario name or a part of the scenario's name. So for my example of trying to improve my static, if I type in 1W, one of the scenarios that comes up is 1W2TS, and by removing two of the dots, it forces me to isolate the larger flick specifically. Then if I search for that, 1W2TS Pokeball appears, which is a variant where I don't have to click, and I can just hold down mouse 1 for the entire scenario, letting me be even more specific with my practice. And then I can type in Pokeball and try all of these and so on. By trying different variants and taking note when a scenario is really good at targeting a certain issue, either mentally or by writing them down, you can build up a list of scenarios to refer to when you do identify an issue to work on. But of course, the hardest part of all of this is figuring out what a scenario actually trains. This is challenging for so many reasons and varies based on your approach, but I think that tearing down the core categorization the benchmarks use is a good start. And I know I've used this structure all throughout the video. It does have its uses, but when looking at aim at a deeper level, I think it's counterproductive to keep this limited framework. I'm sure you've heard something like static and dynamic for Valorant, smoothness is good for Apex, and reactive for Overwatch, and all of this is true, but I think it overlooks how interconnected aiming actually is as a skill. Like I broke down earlier, static isn't training you to hit stationary targets, it's isolating and refining your ability to make accurate initial flicks and micro-adjust afterwards. This level of deconstruction can be done to every category. They each develop core skills that will be applicable to other categories and games even if they don't explicitly contain that skill. So then, what is tracking training? Well, your tracking, but also your micro-adjustments. When you break down a scenario like Control Sphere, it consists of a micro-adjustment and a follow-through, and when you look at it like this, its application in Valorant becomes a bit more clear. It's training those core movements, and even though they won't be as exaggerated in-game, that control still translates. How about Air then? Air trains a lot of things based on which bot you're on, but I'd like to zoom into this one. These long strafes are working on your ability to track other long strafes, but also developing the skill of going from a wrist micro adjustment into tracking with your arm while maintaining good smoothness. And then those arm movements are working on your stability, giving you a finer control over the speed your arm is moving at, which then, weirdly enough, will help your static dots. By developing that control with your arms, slowing down at the end of a flick becomes easier, your movements get less jagged, and transitioning into a micro adjustment is more fluid because you've already trained blending different muscle groups together. This series of links is kind of like a big ball of string. You find the right string to pull and it all comes loose. This is why working on weaknesses is so crucial as well. Even though it might not be obvious, a weak area might not just be an isolated weakness. It could be holding you back in other areas. This is a topic that extends so far outwards I can't even start to cover it all here, but I hope these two examples are enough to get you thinking about scenarios, the skills they train, and how to work on weaknesses in a new and more in-depth way. And I think that's everything I want to cover in reference to the topic, but I just want to say a massive thank you to making it to the end of this and for all the support on my recent videos. It's a little surreal, to be honest. I wasn't expecting to get to 20k in like months, and it looks like it's not going to be long before we get to 30k now. This has all gotten me to take YouTube and content creation a bit more seriously, and I want to try to do this as a job if I can, so as weird as it sounds to announce, I have a Patreon now. The benefits for each tier are up on the screen, and I've tried my best to offer some nice rewards, but please don't donate if you don't have the money to. This is just if you've got some extra money and want to support what I do. I appreciate you all wanting to watch what I make either way, and thanks again. I'm sure you've all heard the age-old aiming advice of sticking to one sensitivity and mastering it. Through learning the amount of force you need to apply to the mouse in various situations and repeating that motion enough times, through muscle memory you'll develop perfect aim and be able to hit flicks every single time. But that also means that if you change anything, your sense, mousepad, mouse, or start using programs like mouse acceleration, that variance will ruin that muscle memory and force you to relearn everything. But if that was the case, how can people like Tens change their sense and peripherals all the time and still hit flicks like this? Shouldn't he have ruined his muscle memory? The reason why Tens can still do this is because muscle memory is a misnomer. It is a real thing in motor skill development, but the definition given to it within gaming is incorrect. Getting good aim isn't about learning the exact amount of force needed or the exact distance you have to move the mouse to move a certain distance on screen. It's about developing the fine motor control skills needed to move your crosshair exactly where you want it, even with unfamiliar settings or peripherals. Once someone has developed these motor skills enough, they can adjust to and aim well on a new sensitivity almost instantly. The most obvious bit of proof for this is that true consistency in your setup is impossible, even if your sensitivity remains the same. There are always outside factors at play when it comes to aiming that affect the amount of force you have to apply to the mouse to travel a certain distance on screen. Mouse pads and mouse skates wear down over the course of weeks, and humidity causes the amount of force needed to vary from day to day by slowing down your mouse pad. All of this means that memorizing the amount of force required for specific movements and therefore aiming at a high level consistently would be impossible if muscle memory worked the way people describe. But developing good aim isn't impossible. People can and do adjust to that variance, and typically players with good mechanics won't even notice the small changes in friction. But even if that is true and aim is dictated by fine motor control instead of memorizing distances, why not just play the same sensitivity anyway? The short answer is that you should think of your sensitivity as a tool. Each has different strengths and weaknesses, and since changing it doesn't hurt your aim, we can select the sensitivity best suited for what we are doing. The clearest example of this is swapping between different games. The average sensitivity among pros is much faster in Apex than it is in Valorant because of the distinct aiming style required for each game, with Apex having much faster movement speed and putting you in situations that need wide-angle aiming much more often than Valorant does. If you played at a very low sensitivity in Valorant and wanted to pick up Apex, it wouldn't make sense to keep your sensitivity the same for that reason. It's better to change to a different sensitivity that is more suited to the game. The same logic applies for roles within games. It's fairly common for Overwatch players to have different sensitivities for different characters, since what is optimal for each varies so heavily. Even in Valorant, some players switch sense depending on if they're attacking or defending. Holding angles is something that benefits a lot from the stability that a slower sensitivity offers, and you'll do this way more often on defense. Whereas on attack, you'll need to react to people in unexpected positions and clear angles very quickly, which is much easier when you don't have to throw your arm across the mousepad for every single angle. On top of that, there is actually a study which shows that changing sensitivity is good for developing new mechanics. I've linked it in the description if you're interested, but to summarize, there were 3 groups of participants which had to complete a task which involves squeezing a device to move a cursor across a monitor. The first group completed 1 training session per day, the second completed 2 sessions per day 6 hours apart, and the third did the same but with one key difference: the amount of force needed to move the cursor changed between sessions. The 3 groups are all tested again the next day, and while both Group 2 and 3 outperformed Group 1, to quote, "The gains in performance, such as a speedier and more accurate completion of the task, nearly doubled among those in the group who were given the altered second session." This also lines up with common advice given to people looking to break through aiming plateaus, which is basically just to change something up. This can be anything: sensitivity, peripherals, even something like changing my mentality has gotten me out of slumps before.
What?
So if science shows that changing sensitivity helps, why do so many people say they aim worse after changing it and see benefits when sticking to the same one? I think this comes down mainly to muscle groups. When aiming, you use a mixture of 3 things: your fingertips, wrist, and arm, with different sensitivities placing more stress on different areas. Sticking with one sensitivity for a long period of time gets you more proficient with the muscle groups it emphasizes. Using myself as an example, I used to play CS on an extremely slow sensitivity. It was so slow that I didn't need to use my wrist at all to make small adjustments. Everything from wide flicks to micro corrections was done with my arm. It offered me more precision in Counter-Strike, as using a lower sensitivity makes it easier to make smaller movements more accurately, but when I tried to pick up other FPS games, I struggled due to them requiring me to make larger movements more often. When I did change my sensitivity to compensate for this, I realized how poorly suited the arm is to making those smaller movements. It's less controllable since its pivot point is further away from the mouse than the wrist's is. And I couldn't use my wrist for those movements either. I had never had to use it when aiming before, so my control with it was terrible. It wasn't until I started aim training on a higher sensitivity that my fine control with my wrist matched and then surpassed that of my arm, which is when I was finally able to excel on games besides Counter-Strike. This also demonstrates another benefit of changing your sensitivity, which is its potential use as a training tool. Since some sensitivities are better suited for different things, we can do the opposite and use a suboptimal sensitivity to emphasize and improve on different skills when training. Through playing a sense that doesn't fit the task, any issues in our mechanics are made more visible and easier to isolate. An example of this would be using a very low sensitivity on a task that requires fast and long-distance flicks to work on your arm speed, or using a high sensitivity on a precision-focused task to focus on fine control with your wrist. By isolating these skills and practicing them independently, you will improve at that skill far more than if you were playing the same task on your normal sensitivity. All that being said though, there is one situation where I don't think it's good to change up your sense, which is right after dying. I've seen people tilt change their sense a lot, and I've even done it myself, and in my experience, all it does is take your mind off of the game and onto how your sense doesn't feel right. At least for me, when my sensitivity did feel off, it was a sign that there was a weak area in my aim. Changing my sensitivity to try and fix this would have only made other areas weaker without properly addressing the issue, which can only be done through concentrated practice. My mentality surrounding changing sensitivity is to switch it up often when training to focus on different skill sets, but to keep it the same during actual matches, so I can put 100% of my focus onto the game itself instead of thinking about my sensitivity. And if anyone's still not convinced, since I've made reference to TENS a few times during this video, here are his thoughts on the topic. Thanks for watching.
I feel like with holding a mouse, there's a lot of hand-eye coordination. Like what you see is how you move. When I'm playing the game, for example, the reason why I can play somewhat similar on anything or low sense, high sense, doesn't really matter, is because I'm just using hand-eye coordination. That's it. Ultimately, a mouse should feel like an extension of your hand in order for you to play your best. If you might be more comfortable in certain senses and stuff because maybe you like using wrist more, maybe you like using arm more and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just mouse control, not muscle memory.
What is the difference between these two players' aim? Even though the one on the left is snappy and pretty flashy, it's not hard to see their weaknesses. They're shaky on their micro corrections and lack smoothness. Their motions are very jagged. On the other hand, the one on the right is much calmer. They look in control of their crosshair and their motions much more seamless. The thing is, both these players are me. The left is from 3 years ago, the right today, and I'm a much better player for this change. But how did I go from a snappy style to a smooth one, and how did I do it without losing my flicking speed? If you looked up how to improve your smoothness online, you'd probably find something about staying calm and keeping your muscles perfectly relaxed. This is how most people go about getting smooth aim, and it can work for some situations. However, this method of aiming smoothly has one massive weakness. Your muscles are the things that make your aim fast. Relying on keeping them relaxed at all times for smoothness will massively limit your speed or your smoothness at higher speeds. I know this because I tried it. When I decided I wanted to make my aim smoother, I took this approach, but never got better at situations where I had to move quickly. The shakiness would come right back. So how can tension both be bad for smoothness and yet necessary for good aim. Firstly though, let's have a look at why people think you should keep your aim relaxed to begin with. Try placing your hand gently on the mouse and moving it side to side. And now try again while pressing down firmly on all of the buttons. Doing this requires increasing the tension in our fingertips, and it's pretty clear that movements are a bit more stepped when applying that downwards force, which, when done in excess, can absolutely contribute to a lack of smoothness and lead to massive disconnects between motions. So why don't we just not tense our hands when aiming? I think that comes down to the reason people start in the first place. It creates this feeling of control. When aiming at smaller targets or in high-stress situations, it's natural to apply more pressure, and from there, it's an easy habit to get into. That feeling of control is fake, though. Increasing tension in those situations makes it harder to make any movement, intentional or unintentional. So while you might become a bit more stable, it will make adjusting to movements next to impossible. Between the mechanical issues it causes and the risk to your hands' health it presents, excessive fingertip tension is absolutely a habit you should try to break. So it's clear where tension got its reputation from. People were applying too much when holding the mouse, stopped and noticed that their smoothness improved, then concluded that all tension was bad. But what if I told you that grip tension wasn't the only type of it, and that correctly utilizing the other types is the actual way to not only get better at reducing grip tension, but also for getting smoother aim? But to achieve this, we need to understand how tension affects different parts of our aim, both positive and negative, and figure out how we can avoid those problems that are so commonly associated with it. Let's go back to the clip from the start of the video again. That sudden burst of speed is achieved using tension, but instead of being located in the mouse grip, this tension is in the muscles of my wrist and arm. I have to place some stress in those muscles to get to that fast flicking speed. But then, how do I stop that movement? My approach at the time was to apply even more tension at the end of the flick. I like to think of tension as a scale from 1 to 10. The start of a movement like this might be a 5 and the end might be an 8. And this looks like it works. My crosshair does stop. But look at what happens after. I can't make the smooth micro adjustment that I need to reach the target. This is because we only have a limited amount of tension to go around. You can test this for yourself. Tense your arm as much as you possibly can to the point of it almost vibrating for 5 to 10 seconds, and then try to make very small movements with your arm straight away. It takes a while for it to recover from that exertion. The first movements will be shaky and jagged and only start to smooth out over time. This is called lockout and is what happens when you try to use more tension than you have available. In the case of the clip from earlier, I add extra tension to stop but have to wait to release that tension before I can micro adjust smoothly. I know we're talking fractions of a second here, but in a gunfight this difference is significant. Tensed, not tensed, tensed, not tensed. This is just in the short term though, a tiny delay after an extreme burst of tension. But that isn't the only time this can happen. Both high amounts of tension very quickly and moderate amounts of tension over a long period of time can cause the exact same effect. An example of this might be a teamfight in Apex. If your tension starts high and stays high, eventually you'll experience that same feeling. Your muscles will lock up and they just won't move right. So again, it seems like tension is a bad thing here. It's causing either a delay after any flick shot or shaky adjustments. But that's only if you don't know how to control it. I have found it helpful to think of high tension like sprinting. It does offer a very powerful burst of speed, but comes at the cost of a lot of energy. We have to rest and recover after doing it. You'll tire yourself out too fast otherwise. But if you were to jog instead, or sprint for a little before going to a jog to let yourself recover, you'll be able to sustain a higher average speed for longer. This is the core idea behind managing tension over any period of time, controlling when you utilize it and when you relax to get the most out of the tension you do have, your tension budget. The second method of stopping the momentum of a flick is that idea compressed into the space of a single mouse movement. You release the tension from the start of the flick before you reach the target. Let the momentum generated carry you the rest of the way. This is tension budgeting in the short term, going from a sprint to a jog. After implementing this technique, I was able to make those snappy movements while still being able to adjust fluidly afterwards. I wasn't stuck in that recovery period. This is exactly how good tension management leads to good smoothness. Having smooth aim isn't just about moving at one speed consistently. It's about being able to dynamically go between different speeds as required, smoothly blending fast flick shots into controlled micro adjustments with no delay or shakiness in between, which is impossible without using tension. Through controlling that tension, we can combine the benefits of a smooth style, the seamless movements and lack of shakiness, with the speed of a snappier style. Then what about for even faster movements? Large angle flick shots like these, does the same idea of releasing tension mid-flick still apply there? Yeah, and if anything, it gets more important the larger the flick is. The more you have to move your mouse and the faster you move your mouse, the more tension you use and inertia you create, which all still has to be counteracted to stop that movement. So stopping the mouse using tension requires more of it, the downsides get worse, but stopping by releasing tension gets easier, since the window you have to release it in gets larger. On top of that though, there is another technique we can implement here to make our movements flow together even better. But to explain that, I first need to talk about muscle groups. There are two muscle groups that most people use to move the mouse, the wrist and the arm. Because of its smaller range of motion, the wrist is more suited to smaller movements like the one showed earlier. The arm, on the other hand, has a higher maximum speed and a wider range of motion, so we want to primarily use it for larger movements. Since tension is just us activating our muscles, that means that we can tense each muscle group individually. So for flicks, we can tense our arm without tensing our wrist. What this means is that even if we can't release all of that tension we needed to start the flick in our arm in time, we can still make follow-up movements with our wrist since it already had very low tension. Each muscle group has independent tension budgets, so we can dynamically change how much tension we are applying to each one to let the other recover. This applies across every type of aiming as well. For example, start a track by adjusting with your wrist and slowly transition into following through with your arm. The arm and wrist aren't the only two muscle groups we can use though. Remember grip tension, the thing that was never good and was the cause of unsmooth aim? Coming back to it after learning all of this about dynamic tension management gave me an idea. What if fingertip tension is similar, useful when controlled properly? And it is. Utilizing my fingertips when aiming was honestly a pretty massive breakthrough for me, even though at the time I didn't move the mouse with my fingertips at all. The first benefit this has is stability. Since placing more tension in your fingertips will make movements more rigid and snappy, even if those movements are made with a different muscle group, varying the amount of fingertip tension you have opens up a way to get similar benefits to what wrist tension offers without actually tensing your wrist. So when tracking a target, if you have to correct for a change in direction, you might place some tension in your fingertips to make that correction snappier, which will work even if you don't move the mouse with your fingertips at all. Dynamically controlling the amount of tension I placed in my fingertips, adding or removing it as needed, was what finally got rid of my issues with gripping my mouse too tightly. Gaining control over it fixed that weakness. The second and much more impactful element is actually using them to make movements. Even when holding my mouse in a claw grip, they have a surprisingly large range of motion, and since they are the most precise muscle group we have, the accuracy within that range of motion was a lot better than what my wrist could offer. Plus, having a third tension budget to offset tension too helped a lot with my overall tension management over longer periods. Okay, I know this is a lot of information, and it can be pretty hard to grasp what this stuff actually does when looking at it in a purely theoretical context. So, how does tension budgeting on a longer time frame apply in games? A big one for me was trying to flick as quickly as possible between angles. My thought process was that it would reduce the potential downtime where I could get swung and taken by surprise, and kept me feeling locked in, and those things are true. But I didn't realize how much tension those movements used. Snapping between angles caused both a delay between the flick and any movements after in the short term and a long-term tension budgeting issue. My tension would gradually increase as I kept flicking between points, and by the time I actually got into a gunfight, I had none left to utilize, both because of the high tension itself and because I was exclusively using my wrist. Now, through both implementing releasing my tension mid-flick and integrating more muscle groups into my aim, I'm never even close to entering lockout when starting gunfights. Any snaps between angles that do happen are led with my arm, leaving my wrist and fingertips free to micro-adjust if I need to. A similar thing can happen in tracking-focused FPS games as well. After a gunfight that requires a lot of tension, it's easy to unintentionally hold onto it, especially when nerves are factored in, which can result in the same issue, entering the next gunfight almost at the point of lockout. This is why it's good to get into the habit of relaxing your muscles, releasing that tension and refilling your tension budget in preparation for your next engagement. This is probably part of why the advice to take deep breaths, relax and stay calm in games is so effective. It helps encourage good tension management by getting you to relax your muscles. Another thing to be mindful of in games that require tracking is the tension flicks use overall. Even with good tension management, if you are flicking really fast, that recovery period afterwards can cause a disconnect between a flick and a track. Sometimes it can be faster in terms of time to kill to flick a bit slower, especially in games like Apex or Overwatch, just to ensure that you have a smooth transition between the two movements. Now, this information is great and all, but keep in mind, when talking about flicking technique, this is how quickly that is all happening. It is impossible to be aware of this in real time, and I doubt most players who are very good at flicking have even considered it. The value of this knowledge comes from how it informs the habits you strive to develop. Unless you're doing something very wrong, like over-tensing like crazy for every movement or only using your wrist for everything, knowing and understanding this won't change your aim overnight. What it will do is set you up to develop better aiming technique and allow you to work towards a better balance of speed and smoothness. There are two parts to this. The first is being aware of what different levels of tension feel like. The second is being able to control it on both short and long time scales.
这3天的进
I
度
will done
有一
both of
点
these by
跑
playing
透
mostly
了。
tracking scenarios and
今天
intros.
睡好一点，明
Tension
天
plays
看
a
能不
similar
能
role there to what it
能不
does in
能
flicking. It is a
有更好的分数吧。今天先 screenshot 这个。